What need hath man of Eden past or paradise to come, when heaven is round us and within ourselves? Lowliness is the base of every virtue. Who goes the lowest builds, doubt not, the safest. Bailey. Truth is within ourselves. It takes no rise from outward things, whatever you may believe. Browning. It is one of the paradoxes of truth that we gain by giving up. We lose by greedily grasping. Every gain in virtue necessitates some loss in vice. Every ascension of holiness means some selfish pleasure yielded up, and every forward step on the path of truth demands the forfeit of some self-assertive error. He who would be clothed in new garments must first cast away the old, and he who would find the true must sacrifice the false. The gardener digs in the woods in order that they may feed, with their decay, the plants which are good for food, and the tree of wisdom can only flourish on the compost of uprooted follies. Growth, gain, necessitates sacrifice, loss. The true life, the blessed life, the life that is not tormented with passions and pains, is reached only through sacrifice, not necessarily the sacrifice of outward things, but the sacrifice of the inward errors and defilements. For it is these, and these only, which bring misery into life. It is not the good and true that needs to be sacrificed, but the evil and false. Therefore, all sacrifice is ultimately gain, and there is no essential loss. Yet at first the loss seems great, and the sacrifice is painful. But this is because of the self-delusion and spiritual blindness which always accompanies selfishness, and pain must always accompany the cutting away of some selfish portion of one's nature. When the drunkard resolves to sacrifice his lust for strong drink, he passes through a period of great suffering, and he feels that he is forfeiting a great pleasure. But when his victory is complete, when the lust is dead, and his mind is calm and sober, then he knows that he has gained incalculably by the giving up of his selfish animal pleasure. What he has lost was evil and false, and not worth keeping. Nay, its keeping entailed continual misery. But what he has gained in character, in self-control, in soberness, had greater peace of mind, is good and true, and it was necessary that he should acquire it. So it is with all true sacrifice. It is at first, and it is until completed, painful, and this is why men shrink from it. They cannot see any purpose in abstaining from and overcoming selfish gratification. It seems to them like losing so much that is sweet, seems to them like courting misery and giving up all happiness and pleasure. And this must be so, for if a man could know that by giving up his particular forms of selfishness, his gain in happiness would be immeasurably greater, unselfishness, which is now so difficult of attainment, would then be rendered indefinitely more difficult of achievement, for his desire for the greater gain, his selfishness, would thereby be greatly intensified. No man can become unselfish and thereby arrive at the highest bliss until he is willing to lose, looking for neither gain nor reward. It is this state of mind which constitutes unselfishness. A man must be willing to humbly sacrifice his selfish habits and practices because they are untrue and unworthy, and for the happiness of those about him, without expecting any reward or looking for any good to accrue to himself. He must be prepared to lose for himself, to forfeit pleasure and happiness, even life itself, if by so doing he can make the world more beautiful and happy. But does he lose? Does the miser lose when he gives up his lust for gold? Does the thief lose when he abandons stealing? Does a libertine lose when he sacrifices his unworthy pleasures? No man loses by the sacrifice of self or some portion of self. Nevertheless, he thinks he will lose by so doing. And because he thinks so, he suffers, and this is where the sacrifice comes in. This is where he gains by losing. All true sacrifice is within. It is spiritual and hidden, and is prompted by deep humility of heart. Nothing but the sacrifice of self can avail, and to this must all men come sooner or later during their spiritual evolution. But in what does this self-abnegation consist? How is it practiced? Where is it sought and found? It consists in overcoming the daily proneness to selfish thoughts and acts. It is practiced in our common intercourse with others, and it is found in the hour of tumult and temptation. There are hidden sacrifices of the heart, which are infinitely blessed, both to him that makes them and those for whom they are made, albeit their making costs much effort and some pain. Men are anxious to do some great thing, to perform some great sacrifice, which lies beyond the necessities of their experience, while all the time, perhaps, they are neglecting the one thing needful, are blind to that sacrifice, which by its very nearness is rendered imperative. What lurks your besetting sin? Where lies your weakness? Where does temptation assail you most strongly? There shall you make your first sacrifice, and shall find thereby the way unto your peace. Perhaps it is anger or unkindness. Are you prepared to sacrifice the angry impulse in word, the unkind thought in deed? Are you prepared to silently endure abuse, attack, accusation, and unkindness, refusing to pay back these in their own coin? Are you prepared to give in return for these dark follies kindness and loving protection? If so, then you are ready to make those hidden sacrifices which lead to beautiful bliss. If you are given to anger or unkindness, offer it up. These hard, cruel, and wrong conditions of mind never brought you any good. They can never bring you anything but unrest, misery, and spiritual blindness. Nor can they ever bring to others anything but unhappiness. Perhaps you will say, "But he was unkind to me first. He treated me unjustly." Perhaps so, but what a poor excuse is this! What an unmanly and ineffectual refuge! For if his unkindness towards you is so wrong and hurtful, yours to him must be equally so. Because another is unkind to you is no justification for your own unkindness, but is rather a call for the exercise of great kindness on your part. Can the pouring in of more water prevent a flood? Neither can unkindness lessen unkindness. Can fire quench fire? Neither can anger overcome anger. Offer up all unkindness, all anger. It takes two to make a quarrel. Don't be the other one. If one is angry or unkind to you, try to find out where you have acted wrongly, and whether you have acted wrongly or not, do not throw back the angry word or unkind act. Remain silent, self-contained, and kindly disposed, and learn by continual effort in right doing to have compassion upon the wrongdoer. Perhaps you are habitually impatient and irritable. Know then the hidden sacrifice which it is needful that you should make. Give up your impatience. Overcome it there where it is wont to assert itself. Resolve that you will yield no longer to its tyrannical sway, but will conquer it and cast it out. It is not worth keeping a single hour, nor would it dominate you for another moment if you were not laboring under the delusion that the follies and perversities of others render impatience on your part necessary. Whatever others may do or say, even though they may mock and taunt you, impatience is not only unnecessary, it can never do any other than aggravate the evil which it seeks to remove. Calm, strong, and deliberate action can accomplish much, but impatience and its accompanying irritability are always indications of weakness and inefficiency. And what do they bestow upon you? Do they bestow rest, peace, happiness, or bring these to those about you? Do they not rather make you and those about you wretched? But though your impatience may hurt others, it certainly hurts and wounds and impoverishes yourself most of all. Nor can the impatient man know aught of true blessedness, for he is a continual source of trouble and unrest to himself. The calm beauty and perpetual sweetness of patience are unknown to him, and peace cannot draw near to soothe and comfort him. There is no blessedness anywhere until impatience is sacrificed, and its sacrifice means the development of endurance, the practice of forbearance, and the creation of a new and gentler habit of mind. When impatience and irritability are entirely put away, are finally offered up on the altar of unselfishness, then is realized and enjoyed the blessedness of a strong, quiet, and peaceful mind. Each hour we think of others more than self, that hour we live again, and every lowly sacrifice we make for others' good shall make life more than self, and open the windows of thy soul to light from higher spheres. So hail thy lot with joy. Then there are little selfish indulgences, some of which appear harmless and are commonly fostered, but no selfish indulgence can be harmless, and men and women do not know what they lose by repeatedly and habitually succumbing to effeminate and selfish gratifications. If the God in man is to rise strong and triumphant, the beast in man must perish. The pandering to the animal nature, even when it appears innocent and seems sweet, leads away from truth and blessedness. Each time you give way to the animal within you, feed and gratify him, he waxes stronger and more rebellious, and takes firmer possession of your mind, which should be in keeping of truth. Not until a man has sacrificed some apparently trivial indulgence does he discover what strength, what joy, what poise of character and holy influence he has all along been losing by that gratification. Not until a man sacrifices his hankering for pleasure does he enter into the fullness of abiding joy. By his personal indulgences a man demeans himself, forfeits self-respect to the extent and frequency of his indulgence, and deprives himself of the exemplary influence and the power to accomplish lasting good in his work in the world. He also, by allowing himself to be led by blind desire, increases his mental blindness, and fails of the ultimate clearness of vision, that clarified percipience which pierces to the heart of things and comprehends the real and the true. Animal indulgence is alien to the perception of truth. By the sacrifice of his indulgences, man rises above confusion and doubt, and arrives at the possession of insight and surety. Sacrifice your cherished and coveted indulgence. Fix your mind on something higher, nobler, and more enduring than ephemeral pleasure. Live superior to the craving for sense excitement, and you will live neither vainly nor uncertainly, very far-reaching in its effect upon others. The rich with the revelations of truth for him who makes it is the sacrifice of self-assertion, the giving up of all interference with the lives, views, or religions of other people, substituting for it an understanding love and sympathy. Self-assertion, or opinionativeness, is a form of egotism or selfishness most generally found in connection with intellectualism and dialectical skill. It is blindly presumptive and uncharitable, and more often than not is regarded as a virtue. But once the mind has opened to perceive the way of gentleness and self-sacrificing love, then the ignorance, deformity, and painful nature of self-assertion become apparent. The victim of self-assertion, setting up his own opinions as the standard of right and the measure of judgment, regards all those as wrong whose lives and opinions run counter to his own, and being eager to put others right, is thereby prevented from putting himself right. His attitude of mind brings about him opposition and contradiction from people who are anxious to put him right, and this wounds his vanity and makes him miserable, so that he lives in an almost constant fever of unhappy, resentful, and uncharitable thoughts. There can be no peace for such a man, no true knowledge, and no advancement until he sacrifices his desire to bend others to his own way of thinking and acting. Nor can he understand the hearts of others and enter lovingly into their strivings and aspirations. His mind is cramped and embittered, and he is shut out from all sweet sympathy and spiritual communion. He who sacrifices the spirit of self-assertion, who in his daily contact with others put aside his prejudices and opinions, and strives both to learn from others and to understand them as they are, who allows to others perfect liberty, such as he exercises himself, to choose their own opinions, their own way of life. Such a man will acquire a deeper insight, a broader charity, and a richer bliss than he has hitherto experienced, and will strike a byway of blessedness from which he has formerly shut out. Then there is sacrifice of greed and all greedy thoughts, the willingness that others should possess rather than we, the not coveting of things for ourselves, but rejoicing that they are possessed and enjoyed by others, that they bring happiness to others, the ceasing to claim one's own, and the giving up to others, unselfishly and without malice, that which they exact. This attitude of mind is a source of deep peace and great spiritual strength. It is the sacrifice of self-interest. Material possessions are temporary, and in this sense we cannot truly call them our own. They are merely in our keeping for a short time, but spiritual possessions are eternal and must ever remain with us. Unselfishness is a spiritual possession, which is only secured by ceasing to covet material possessions and enjoyments, by ceasing to regard things as for our own special and exclusive pleasure, and by our readiness to yield them up for the good of others. The unselfish man, even though he finds himself involved in riches, stands aloof, in his mind, from the idea of exclusive possession, and so escapes the bitterness and fear and anxiety which ever accompany the covetous spirit. He does not regard any of his outward accretions as being too valuable to lose, but he regards the true virtue of unselfishness as being too valuable in the world, too suffering humanity, to lose or cast away. And who is the blessed man? He who is ever hankering after more possessions, thinking only of the personal pleasure he can get out of them, or he who is ready to give up what he has for the good and happiness of others? By greed, happiness is destroyed. By not greed, happiness is restored. Another hidden sacrifice, one of great spiritual beauty and of powerful efficacy in the healing of human sorrows, is the sacrifice of hatred, the giving up of all bitter thoughts against others, of all malice, dislike, and resentment. Bitter thoughts and blessedness cannot dwell together. Hatred is a fierce fire that scorches up, in the heart of him who harbors it, all the sweet flowers of peace and happiness, and makes a hell of every place where it comes. Hatred has many names and many forms, but only one essence, namely, burning thoughts of resentment against others. It is sometimes, by its blind votaries, called by the name of religion, causing them to attack, slander, and persecute each other, because they will not accept each other's views of life and death, thus filling the earth with miseries and tears. All resentment, dislike, ill-thinking, and ill-speaking of others is hatred, and where there is hatred there is always unhappiness. No one has conquered hatred, while thoughts of resentment toward others spring up in his mind. This sacrifice is not complete until a man can think kindly of those who try to do him wrong. Yet it must be made before true blessedness can be realized and known. Beyond the hard, cruel, steely gates of hatred waits the divine angel of love, ready to reveal herself to him who will subdue and sacrifice his hateful thoughts and conduct him to his peace. Whatever others may say of you, whatever they may do to you, never take offense. Do not return hatred with hatred. If another hates you, perhaps you have, consciously or unconsciously, failed somewhere in your conduct, or there may be some misunderstanding which the exercise of a little gentleness and reason may remove. But under all circumstances, Father, forgive them, is infinitely better, sweeter, and nobler than I will have nothing more to do with them. Hatred is so small and poor, so blind and wretched. Love is so great and rich, so far-seeing and blissful. The highest culture is to speak no ill. The best reformer is the man whose eyes are quick to see all beauty and all worth, and by his own discreet, well-ordered life alone reproves the erring. Sacrifice all hatred, slay it upon the holy altar of devotion to others. Think no more of injury to your own petty self, but see to it that henceforth you injure and wound no other. Open the floodgates of your heart for the inpouring of that sweet, great, beautiful love, which embraces all with strong yet tender thoughts of protection and peace, leaving not one, not even he who hates or despises or slanders you, out in the cold. Then there is the hidden sacrifice of impure desires, of weak self-pity and degrading self-praise, of vanity and pride, for these are unblessed attitudes of mind, deformities of heart. He who makes them one by one, gradually subduing and overcoming them, will, according to the measure of his success, rise above weakness and suffering and sorrow, and will comprehend and enjoy the perfect and imperishable blessedness. Now all these hidden sacrifices, which are here mentioned, are pure, humble heart offerings. They are made within, are offered up on the sacred, lowly, unseen altar of one's own heart. Not one of them can be made until the fault is first silently acknowledged and confessed. No man can sacrifice an error until he first of all confesses to himself, I am in error. When yielding it up, he will perceive and receive the truth which his error formerly obscured. The kingdom of heaven cometh not by observation, and the silent sacrifice of self for the good of others, the daily giving up of one's egotistic tendencies, is not seen and rewarded of men, and brings no loud blazon of popularity and praise. It is hidden away from the eyes of the world, even from the gaze of those who are nearest to you, for no eyes of flesh can perceive its spiritual beauty. But think not that because it is unperceived, it is therefore futile. Its blissful radiance is enjoyed by you, and its power for good over others is great and far-reaching. For though they cannot see it, nor perhaps understand it, yet they are unconsciously influenced by it. They will not know what silent battles you are fighting, what eternal victories over self you are achieving. But they will feel your altered attitude, your new mind, wrought of the fabric of love and loving thoughts, and will share somewhat in its happiness and bliss. They will know nothing of the frequent fierceness of the fight you are waging, of the wounds you receive and the healing balm you apply, of the anguish and the afterpeace. But they will know that you have grown sweeter and gentler, stronger and more silently self-reliant, more patient and pure, and that they are rested and helped by your presence. What rewards can compare with this? Beside the fragrant offices of love, the praises of men are gross and fulsome, and in the pure flame of a selfless heart, the flatteries of the world are turned to ashes. Love is its own reward, its own joy, its own satisfaction. It is the final refuge and resting place of passion-tortured souls. The sacrifice of self and the acquisition of the supreme knowledge and bliss which it confers is not accomplished by one great and glorious act, but by a series of lesser and successive sacrifices in the ordinary life of the world, by a succession of steps in the daily conquest of truth over selfishness. He who each day accomplishes some victory over himself, who subdues and puts behind him some unkind thought, some impure desire, some tendency to sin, is every day growing stronger, purer, and wiser, and every dawn finds him nearer to that final glory of truth, which each self-sacrificing act reveals in part. Look not outside thee, nor beyond thee for the light and blessedness of truth, but look within. Thou wilt find it within, the narrow sphere of thy duty, even in the humble and hidden sacrifices of thine own heart. When thy gaze turns it on thine own soul, be most severe. But when it falls upon a fellow man, let kindliness control it, and refrain from that belittling censure that brings forth from common lips like weeds from marshy soil. Ella Wheeler Wilcox. I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person. Walt Whitman. We can only sympathize with others insofar as we have conquered ourselves. We cannot think and feel for others while we are engaged in condoling with and pitying ourselves, cannot deal tenderly and lovingly with others while we are anxious for our own preeminence or for the exclusive preservation of ourselves, our opinions, or our own generally. What is sympathy but thoughtfulness for others in the forgetfulness of self? To sympathize with others, we must first understand them, and to understand them, we must put away all our personal preconceptions concerning them, and must see them as they are. We must enter into their inner state and become one with them, looking through their mental eyes and comprehending the range of their experience. You cannot, of course, do this with a being whose wisdom and experience are greater than your own, nor can you do it with any if you regard yourself as being on a higher plane than others, for egotism and sympathy cannot dwell together. But you can practice it with all those who are involved in sins and sufferings from which you have successfully extricated yourself. And though your sympathy cannot embrace and overshadow the man whose greatness is beyond you, you can place yourself in such an attitude towards him as to receive the protection of his larger sympathy, and so make for yourself an easier way out of the sins and sufferings by which you are still enchained. Prejudice and ill will are complete barriers to the giving of sympathy, while pride and vanity are total barriers to its reception. You cannot sympathize with a person for whom you have conceived a hatred. You cannot enjoy the sympathy of one whom you envy. You cannot understand the person whom you dislike, or he for whom, through animal impulse, you have framed an ill-formed affection. You cannot see him as he really is, but only see your own imperfect notions of him, see only a distorted image of him through the exaggerating medium of your ill-grounded opinions. To see others as they are, you must not allow impulsive likes and dislikes, powerful prejudices, or egotistic considerations to come between you and them. You must not resent their actions or condemn their beliefs and opinions. You must leave yourself entirely out, and must, for the time being, assume their position. Only in this way can you become in rapport with them, and so fathom their life, their experience, and understand it. And when a man is understood, it becomes impossible to condemn him. Men misjudge, condemn, and avoid each other because they do not understand each other, and they do not understand each other because they have not overcome and purified themselves. Life is growth, development, evolution, and there is no essential distinction between the sinner and the saint. There is only a difference in degree. The saint was once a sinner. The sinner will one day be a saint. The sinner is the child. The saint is the grown man. He who separates himself from sinners, regarding them as wicked men to be avoided, is like a man avoiding contact with little children because they are unwise, disobedient, and play with toys. All life is one, but it has a variety of manifestations. The grown flower is not something distinct from the tree. It is a part of it. It is only another form of leaf. Steam is not something apart from water, but it is another form of water. And in like manner, good is transmuted evil. The saint is the sinner, developed and transformed. The sinner is one whose understanding is undeveloped, and he ignorantly chooses wrong modes of action. The saint is one whose understanding is ripened, and he chooses right modes of action. The sinner condemns the sinner, condemnation being a wrong mode of action. The saint never condemns the sinner, remembering that he himself formerly occupied the same place, but thinks of him with deep sympathy, regarding him in the light of a younger brother or a friend, for sympathy is a right and enlightened mode of action. The perfected saint, who gives sympathy to all, needs it of none, for he has transcended sin and suffering, and lives in the enjoyment of lasting bliss. But all who suffer need sympathy, and all who sin must suffer. When a man comes to understand that every sin, whether of thought or deed, receives his just quota of suffering, he ceases to condemn and begins to sympathize, seeing the sufferings which sin entails, and he comes to such understanding by purifying himself. As a man purges himself of passions, as he transmutes his selfish desires and puts underfoot his egotistic tendencies, he sounds the depths of all human experiences, all sins and sufferings and sorrows, all motives and thoughts and deeds, and comprehends the moral law in its perfection. Complete self-conquest is perfect knowledge, perfect sympathy, and he who views men with a stainless vision of a pure heart views them with a pitying heart, sees them as a part of himself, not as something defiled and separate and distinct, but as his very self, sinning as he has sinned, suffering as he has suffered, sorrowing as he has sorrowed, and yet, withal, glad in the knowledge that they will come, as he has come, to perfect peace at last. The truly good and wise man cannot be a passionate partisan, but extends his sympathy to all, seeing no evil in others to be condemned and resisted, but seeing the sin which is pleasant to the sinner, and the after sorrow and pain which the sinner does not see, and when it overtakes him, does not understand. A man's sympathy extends just so far as his wisdom reaches, and no further, and a man only grows wiser as he grows tenderer and more compassionate. To narrow one's sympathy is to narrow one's heart, and so to darken and embitter one's life. To extend and broaden one's sympathy is to enlighten and gladden one's life, and to make plainer to others the way of light and gladness. To sympathize with another is to receive his being into our own, to become one with him, for unselfish love unites, and he whose sympathy reaches out to and embraces all humankind and all living creatures has realized his identity and oneness with all, and comprehends the universal love and law and wisdom. Man is shut out from heaven and peace and truth only insofar as he shuts out others from his sympathy. Where his sympathy ends, his darkness and torment and turmoil begins. For to shut others out from our love is to shut ourselves out from the blessedness of love, and to become cramped in the dark prison of self. Whoever walks a furlong without sympathy walks to his own funeral dressed in a shroud. Only when one's sympathy is unlimited is the eternal light of truth revealed. Only in the love that knows no restriction is the boundless bliss enjoyed. Sympathy is bliss. In it is revealed the highest, purest blessedness. It is divine, for in its reciprocal light all thought of self is lost, and there remains only the pure joy of oneness with others, the ineffable communion of spiritual identity. Where a man ceases to sympathize, he ceases to live, ceases to see and realize and know. One cannot truly sympathize with others until all selfish considerations concerning them are put away, and he who does this and strives to see others as they are, strives to realize their particular sins, temptations and sorrows, their beliefs, opinions and prejudices, comes at last to see exactly where they stand in their spiritual evolution, comprehends the arc of their experience, and knows that they cannot for the present act otherwise than they do. He sees that their thoughts and acts are prompted by the extent of their knowledge, or their lack of knowledge, and that if they act blindly and foolishly, it is because their knowledge and experience are immature, and they can only come to act more wisely by gradual growth into more enlightened states of mind. He also sees that though this growth can be encouraged, helped, and stimulated by the influence of a riper example, by seasonable words and well-timed instruction, it cannot be unnaturally forced. The flowers of love and wisdom must have time to grow, and the barren branches of hatred and folly cannot be cut away all at once. Such a man finds the doorway into the inner world of those with whom he comes in contact, and he opens it and enters in, and dwells with them in the hidden and sacred sanctuary of their being. And he finds nothing to hate, nothing to revile, nothing to condemn in that sacred place, but something to love and tend, and in his own heart room only for greater pity, greater patience, greater love. He sees that he is one with them, but that they are another aspect of him, that their natures are not different from his own, except in modification and degree, but they are identical with it. If they are acting out certain sinful tendencies, he has but to look within to find the same tendencies in himself, albeit perhaps restrained or purified. If they are manifesting certain holy and divine qualities, he finds the same pure spirit within himself, though perhaps in a lesser degree of power and development. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. The sin of one is the sin of all. The virtue of one is the virtue of all. No man can be separate from another. There is no difference of nature, but only difference of condition. If a man thinks he is separated from another by virtue of his superior holiness, he is not so separated, and his darkness and delusion are very great. Humanity is one, and in the holy sanctuary of sympathy, saint and sinner meet and unite. It is said of Jesus that he took upon himself the sins of the whole world. That is, he identified himself with those sins, and did not regard himself as essentially separate from sinners, but as being of a like nature with them. And his realization of his oneness with all men was manifested in his life, as profound sympathy for those who, for their deep sins, were avoided and cast off by others. And who is it that is in the greatest need of sympathy? Not the saint, not the enlightened seer, not the perfect man. It is the sinner, the unenlightened man, the imperfect one, and the greater the sin, the greater is the need. I came not to call the righteousness, but sinners to repentance, is the statement of one who has comprehended all human needs. The righteous man does not need your sympathy, but the unrighteous, he who, by his wrongdoing, is laying up for himself long periods of suffering and woe, is in need of it. The flagrantly unrighteous man is condemned, despised, and avoided by those who are living in a similar condition to himself, though for the time being they may not be subject to his particular form of sin, for that withholding of sympathy and that mutual condemnation which are so rife is the commonest manifestation of that lack of understanding in which all sin takes its rise. While a man is involved in sin, he will condemn others who are likewise involved, and the deeper and greater his sin, the more severe will be his condemnation of others. It is only when a man begins to sorrow for his sin, and so to rise above it, and into the clearer light of purity and understanding, that he ceases from condemning others, and learns to sympathize with them. But this ceaseless condemnation of each other, by those who are involved in the fierce play of the passions, must needs be, for it is one of the modes of operation of the great law which universally and eternally obtains, and the unrighteous one, who falls under the condemnation of his fellows, will the more rapidly reach a higher and nobler condition of heart and life, if he humbly accepts the censure of others as the effect of his own sin, and resolves henceforward to refrain from all condemnation of others. The truly good and wise man condemns none. Having put away all blind passion and selfishness, he lives in the calm regions of love and peace, and understands all modes of sin, with their consequent sufferings and sorrows. Enlightened and awakened, freed from all selfish bias, and seeing men as they are, his heart responds in holy sympathy with all. Should any condemn, abuse, or slander him, he throws them around the kindly protection of his sympathy, seeing the ignorance which prompts them to so act, and knowing that they alone will suffer for their wrong acts. Learn, by self-conquest and the acquisition of wisdom, to love him who you now condemn, to sympathize with those who condemn you. Turn your eyes away from their condemnation and search your own heart to find, perchance, some hard, unkind, or wrong thoughts, which when discovered and understood, you will condemn yourself. Much that is commonly called sympathy is personal affection. To love them who love us is human bias and inclination, but to love them who do not love us is divine sympathy. Sympathy is needed because of the prevalence of suffering, for there is no being or creature who has not suffered. Through suffering, sympathy is evolved. Not in a year or a life or an age is the human heart purified and softened by suffering, but after many lives of intermittent pain, after many ages of ever-recurring sorrow, man reaps the golden harvest of his experiences and garners in the rich, ripe sheaves of love and wisdom. And when he understands, and understanding, he sympathizes. All suffering is the result of ignorantly violated law, and after many repetitions of the same wrong act, the same kind of suffering resulting from that act, knowledge of the law is acquired, and the higher state of obedience and wisdom is reached. Then there blossoms the pure and perfect flower of sympathy. One aspect of sympathy is that of pity for the distressed or pain-stricken, with a desire to alleviate or help them bear their sufferings. The world needs more of this divine quality, for pity makes the world soft to the weak and noble for the strong. But it can only be developed by eradicating all hardness and unkindness, all accusation and resentment. He who, when he sees another suffering for his sin, hardens his heart and thinks or says, "It serves him right," such a one cannot exercise pity, nor apply its healing balm. Every time a man acts cruelly towards another, be it only a dumb creature, or refuses to bestow needed sympathy, he dwarfs himself, deprives himself of ineffable blessedness, and prepares himself for suffering. Another form of sympathy is that of rejoicing with those who are more successful than ourselves, as though their success were our own. Blessed indeed is he who is free from all envy and malice, and can rejoice and be glad when he hears of the good fortune of those who regard him as an enemy. The protecting of creatures weaker and more indefensible than oneself is another form in which this divine sympathy is manifested. The helpless frailty of the dumb creation calls for the exercise of the deepest sympathy. The glory of superior strength resides in its power to shield, not to destroy. Not by the callous destruction of weaker things is life truly lived, but by their preservation. All life is linked and kin, and the lowest creature is not separated from the highest by greater weakness, but by lesser intelligence. When we pity and protect, we reveal and enlarge the divine life and joy within ourselves. When we thoughtlessly or callously inflict suffering or destroy, then our divine life becomes obscured, and its joy fades and dies. Bodies may feed bodies and passions, but man's divine nature is only nurtured, sustained, and developed by kindness, love, sympathy, and all pure and unselfish acts. By bestowing sympathy on others, we increase our own. Sympathy given can never be wasted. Even the meanest creature will respond to its heavenly touch, for it is the universal language which all creatures understand. I have recently heard a true story of a Dartmoor convict whose terms of incarceration in various convict stations extended to over 40 years. As a criminal, he was considered one of the most callous and hopelessly abandoned, and the warders found him almost intractable. But one day he caught a mouse, a weak, terrified, hunted thing, like himself, and its helpless frailty, and the similarity of its condition with his own, appealed to him, and started into flame the divine spark of sympathy, which smoldered in his crime-hardened heart, and which no human touch had ever wakened into life. He kept the mouse in an old boot in his cell, fed, tended it, and loved it, and in his love for the weak and helpless, he forgot and lost his hatred for the strong. His heart and hand were no longer against his fellows. He became tractable and obedient to the uttermost. The warders could not understand his change. It seemed to them little short of miraculous that this most hardened of all criminals should be suddenly transformed into the likeness of a gentle, obedient child. Even the expression of his features altered remarkably. A pleasing smile began to play around the mouth, which had formerly been moved to nothing better than a cruel grin, and the implacable hardness of his eyes disappeared and gave place to a soft, deep, mellow light. The criminal was a criminal no longer. He was saved, converted, clothed, and in his right mind, restored to humaneness and to humanity, and set firmly on the pathway to divinity by pitying and caring for a defenseless creature. All this was made known to the warder shortly afterwards, when on his discharge he took the mouse away with him. Thus sympathy bestowed increases its store in our own hearts, and enriches and fructifies our own life. Sympathy given is blessedness received. Sympathy withheld is blessedness forfeited. In the measure that a man increases and enlarges his sympathy, so much nearer does he approach the ideal life, the perfect blessedness. And when his heart has become so mellowed that no hard, bitter, or cruel thought can enter and detract from its permanent sweetness, then indeed is he richly and divinely blessed. If men only understood all the emptiness and acting, of the sleeping and the waking, of the souls they judge so blindly, of the hearts they pierce so unkindly, they, with gentler words and feeling, would apply the balm of healing, if they only understood kindness, nobler ever than revenge. Shakespeare. The remembering of injuries is spiritual darkness. The fostering of resentment is spiritual suicide. To resort to the spirit and practice of forgiveness is the beginning of enlightenment. It is also the beginning of peace and happiness. There is no rest for him who broods over slights and injuries and wrongs. No quiet repose of mind for him who feels that he has been unjustly treated, and who schemes how best to act for the discomfiture of his enemy. How can happiness dwell in a heart that is so disturbed by ill will? Do birds resort to a burning bush wherein to build and sing? Neither can happiness inhabit in that breast that is aflame with burning thoughts of resentment, nor can wisdom come and dwell where such folly resides. Revenge seems sweet only to the mind that is unacquainted with the spirit of forgiveness. But when the sweetness of forgiveness is tasted, then the extreme bitterness of revenge is known. Revenge seems to lead to happiness to those who are involved in the darkness of passion. But when the violence of passion is abandoned, and the mildness of forgiveness is restored to, then it is seen that revenge leads to suffering. Revenge is a virus which eats into the very vitals of the mind and poisons the entire spiritual being. Resentment is a mental fever which burns up the wholesome energies of the mind, and taking offense is a form of moral sickness which saps the healthy flow of kindliness and goodwill, and from which men and women should seek to be delivered. The unforgiving and resentful spirit is a source of great suffering and sorrow, and he who harbors and encourages it, who does not overcome and abandon it, forfeits much blessedness, and does not obtain any measure of true enlightenment. To be hard-hearted is to suffer, to be deprived of light and comfort. To be tender-hearted is to be serenely glad, is to receive light and be well comforted. It will seem strange to many to be told that the hard-hearted and unforgiving suffer most, yet it is profoundly true, for not only do they, by the law of attraction, draw to themselves the revengeful passions in other people, but their hardness of heart itself is a continual source of suffering. Every time a man hardens his heart against a fellow being, he inflicts upon himself 5 kinds of suffering, namely, the suffering of loss of love, the suffering of lost communion and fellowship, the suffering of a troubled and confused mind, the suffering of wounded passion or pride, and the suffering of punishment inflicted by others. Every act of unforgiveness entails upon the doer of that act these 5 sufferings, whereas every act of forgiveness brings to the doer 5 kinds of blessedness: the blessedness of love, the blessedness of increased communion and fellowship, the blessedness of a calm and peaceful mind, the blessedness of passion stilled and pride overcome, and the blessedness and kindness and goodwill bestowed by others. Numbers of people are today suffering the fiery torments of an unforgiving spirit, and only when they make an effort to overcome that spirit can they know what a cruel and exacting taskmaster they are serving. Only those who have abandoned the service of such a master for that of a nobler master of forgiveness can realize and know how grievous a service is the one, how sweet the other. Let a man contemplate the strife of the world, how individuals and communities, neighbors and nations, live in continual retaliations towards each other. Let him realize the heartaches, the bitter tears, the grievous partings and misunderstandings, even the bloodshed and woe which spring from that strife. And thus realizing, he will never again yield to ignoble thoughts of resentment, never again take offense at the actions of others, never again live in unforgiveness towards any being. Have goodwill to all that lives, letting unkindness die, and greed and wrath, so that your lives be made like soft airs passing by. When a man abandons retaliation for forgiveness, he passes from darkness to light. So dark and ignorant is unforgiveness that no being who is at all wise or enlightened could descend to it. But its darkness is not understood and known until left behind, and the better and nobler course of conduct is sought and practiced. Man is blinded and deluded only by his own dark and sinful tendencies, and the giving up of all unforgiveness means the giving up of pride in certain forms of passion, the abandonment of the deeply rooted idea of the importance of oneself and of the necessity for protecting and defending that self. And when that is done, the higher life, greater wisdom, and pure enlightenment, which pride and passion completely obscured, are revealed in all their light and beauty. Then there are petty offenses, little spites and passing slights, which, while of a less serious nature than the deep-seated hatreds and revenges, dwarf the character and cramp the soul. They are due to the sin of self and self-importance, and thrive on vanity. Whosoever is blinded and deluded by vanity will continually see something in the actions and the attitudes of others towards him at which to take offense. And the more there is of vanity, the more greatly will the imaginary slight or wrong be exaggerated. Moreover, to live in the frequent indulgence of petty resentments increases the spirit of hatred and leads gradually downward to greater darkness, suffering, and self-delusion. Don't take offense or allow your feelings to be hurt, which means get rid of pride and vanity. Don't give occasion for offense or hurt the feelings of others, which means be gently considerate, forgiving, and charitable towards all. The giving up, the total uprooting of vanity and pride is a great task, but it is a blessed task, and it can be accomplished by constant practice in non-resentment and by meditating upon one's thoughts and actions so as to understand and purify them, and the spirit of forgiveness is perfected in one in the measure that pride and vanity are overcome and abandoned. The not taking offense and the not giving offense go together. When a man ceases to resent the actions of others, he is already acting kindly towards them, considering them before himself or his own defense. Such a man will be gentle in what he says and does, will arouse love and kindness in others, and not stir them to ill will and strife. He will also be free from all fear concerning the actions of others towards him, for he who hurts none fears none. But the unforgiving man, he who is eager to pay back some real or imaginary slight or injury, will not be considerate towards others, for he considers himself first, and is continually making enemies. He also loves in the fear of others, thinking that they are trying to do towards him as he is doing towards them. He who contrives the hurt of others fears others. There is a beautiful story of Prince Dirghayu, which was told by an ancient Indian teacher to his disciples in order to impress them with the truth of the sublime precept that hatred ceases not by hatred at any time, hatred ceases by non-hatred. The story is as follows. Brahmadatta, a powerful king of Benares, made war upon Dirgheti, the king of Kosala, in order to annex his kingdom, which was much smaller than his own. Dirgheti, seeing that it was impossible for him to resist the greater power of Brahmadatta, fled and left his kingdom in his enemy's hands. For some time he wandered from place to place in disguise, and at last settled down with his queen in an artisan's cottage, and the queen gave birth to a son, whom they called Dirghayu. Now King Brahmadatta was anxious to discover the hiding place of Dirgheti in order to put to death the conquered king, for he thought, seeing that I have deprived him of his kingdom, he may someday treacherously kill me if I do not kill him. But many years passed by, and Dirgheti devoted himself to the education of his son, and by diligent application became learned and skillful and wise. And after a time, Dirgheti's secret became known, and he, fearing that Brahmadatta would discover him and slay all three, and thinking more of the life of his son than his own, sent away the prince. Soon after the exile, the king fell into the hands of Brahmadatta, and was along with his queen executed. Now Brahmadatta thought, I have got rid of Dirgheti and his queen, but their son, Prince Dirghayu, lives, and he will be sure to contrive some means of effecting my assassination. Yet he is unknown to any, and I have no means of discovering him. So the king lived in great fear and continual distress of mind. Soon after the execution of his parents, Dirghayu, under an assumed name, sought employment in the king's stables and was engaged by the master of elephants. Dirghayu quickly endeared himself to all, and his superior abilities came at last under the notice of the king, who had the young man brought before him, and was so charmed with him that he employed him in his own castle, and he proved to be so able and diligent that the king shortly placed him in a position of great trust under himself. One day the king went on a long hunting expedition, and became separated from his retinue, Dirghayu alone remaining with him. And the king, being fatigued with his exertions, lay down, and slept with his head on Dirghayu's lap. Then Dirghayu thought, This king has greatly wronged me. He robbed my father of his kingdom, and slew my parents, and he is now entirely in my power. And he drew his sword, thinking to slay Brahmadatta. But remembering how his father had taught him never to seek revenge, but to forgive to the uttermost, he sheathed his sword. At last the king awoke out of a disturbed sleep, and the youth inquired of him why he looked so frightened. My sleep, said the king, is always restless, for I frequently dream that I am in the power of young Dirghayu, and that he is alone to slay me. While lying here, I again dream that with greater vividness than ever before, and it has filled me with dread and terror. Then the youth, drawing his sword, said, I am Prince Dirghayu, and you are in my power. The time of vengeance has arrived. Then the king fell upon his knees and begged Dirghayu to spare his life. And Dirghayu said, It is you, O king, who must spare my life. For many years you have wished to find me, in order that you might kill me. And now that you have found me, let me beg of you to grant me my life. And there and then did Brahmadatta and Dirghayu grant each other life, took hands, and solemnly vowed never to harm each other. And so overcome was the king by the noble and forgiving spirit of Dirghayu that he gave him his daughter in marriage and restored him to his father's kingdom. Thus hatred ceases by not hatred, by forgiveness, which is very beautiful and is sweeter and more effective than revenge. It is the beginning of love, of that divine love that does not seek its own, and he who practices it, he who perfects in it, comes at last to realize that blessed state wherein the torments of pride and vanity and hatred and retaliation are forever dispelled, and goodwill and peace are unchanging and unlimited. In that state of calm, silent bliss, even forgiveness passes away and is no longer needed, for he who has reached it sees no evil to resent, but only ignorance and illusion on which to have compassion, and forgiveness is only needed so long as there is any tendency to resent, retaliate, and take offense. Equal love towards all is the perfect law, the perfect state to which all lesser states find their completion. Forgiveness is one of the doorways in the faultless temple of love divine.